then go ahead and read that poem if you would.
It matters not how straight the gate, how charged with punishment the scroll. I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul.
Beautiful. Wow, you really, you read that really well. Can you read it one more time, please?
It matters not how straight the gate, how charged with punishment the scroll. I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul.
Beautiful. Wow. That was great.
Ah,
Okay.
I should, is there a place I can do an audition
You just did.
For,
you got the job.
for money?
Now, if you're more comfortable with your glasses, you're welcome to have them on. It's totally up to you.
I prefer, if I can get away with it, to not have to wear it. But like I say, I'm limited in terms I can't read unless it's a foot high.
Me too. I have them always attached around my neck, and they separate.
Yep.
So it makes it easy.
Am I allowed to sip on the coffee while we're talking?
Sure.
Okay.
Where to start with you? Because you're. Well, I'll tell you what. Why don't we start with just a sort of a brief sketch of the chronology. You were the first pilot, naval pilot, shot down over Vietnam. Brief description of the chronology of your time from being shot down to. You don't need to go into a lot of detail yet. We'll touch on places where you feel you'd like to elaborate more. But just so that we always have a way to edit into your story.
Well, where do I start? I was a young naval aviator flying A4 Skyhawks. I was in a A4 squadron on the USS Constellation. I was on my second cruise in the Western Pacific in the summer of 1964. When things started to develop, I mean, really started to develop over the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and we found ourselves out in Yankee Station, which was a point off the coast of the South Vietnam, and we started flying missions that summer, basically crossing over the narrow neck near the 17th parallel into Laos. First we were escorting photo recce planes that were doing reconnaissance photos of the Ho Chi Minh Trail and the activities up and down from the north of Vietnam to the south, and that would be through Laos, in that area. And we found ourselves, I found myself taking a break off the ship. I was heading up a detachment from our squadron. I was a senior lieutenant junior grade, and this was done to make room for other planes from other ships, primarily the USS Ticonderoga. Anyway, bottom line is that we spent some time in the Philippines doing that in late July. And then the Constellation came into port in the Philippines. The Constellation took a week of R&R in Hong Kong, and as we were leaving Hong Kong on August the 4th, 1964, there had been a skirmish out in the Tonkin Gulf between our U.S. Navy destroyer and the two or three of the North Vietnamese torpedo boats. Anyway, as we steamed out of Hong Kong and that night heading for Yankee Station, we got a call that evening that they needed airplanes, that we were going to launch some airplanes that night to come to the aid of two U.S. Navy destroyers that were under attack by North Vietnamese torpedo boats. And as it turns out, our squadron was selected to send 3 A4s, and I was one of them. Other planes from the USS Ticonderoga, which was on station, had already launched airplanes. And as we approached the Yankee station that night, about 11 p.m., we launched 3 aircraft, myself. We were at altitude over the spot, somewhere over the spot. It was pitch black night, dark. That was a dark night. It was big thunderstorms in the area. Couldn't see anything below, but then there was chaos on the radios between the destroyers and the airplanes from the Ticonderoga that were trying to help them. And a lot of confusion. They couldn't see much, so the one lead airplane from the USS Ticonderoga called to see if anybody had flares. It turns out I had flares on my airplane. I should say that prior to this, we were doing some practicing of night, dropping flares at night and bombing out over the Southern California desert. And I often wondered what we were doing that for, but now here it was. So I was dispatched. I went down through the thunderstorm. I managed to drop my flares at the ceiling of the weather, and I managed to light up the sky. I made a drop. I dropped all my flares in a circle, lit up the sky, and I could look back and I could see our 2 destroyers right in the center. A lot of twisting and turning and what have you. I looked hard at the periphery where it turned black of the lit up area there, and I thought I saw tracks, but I wasn't I couldn't be certain. They looked like tracks that a torpedo boat would make and then fire and then turn around and go back, because there was a lot of hairpin type tracks. But I didn't see any boats, torpedo boats. And I was low on fuel, and I had to get up to altitude to get back to the ship. And the other 2 planes in my squadron that had followed me down eventually did fire at things, but nobody really saw anything. Upon recovery that night, which was another harrowing story, they all are when you land on a carrier at night in a stormy sea, but this time I had enough fuel for one pass, and I made it. We went up to brief the admiral on what we saw, and he was rather perturbed that we hadn't seen any torpedo boats. None of us. It turns out that the planes from the Tyco didn't actually see them either. I later found out that the lead airplane was from the Ticonderoga was commander of the squadron, James Stockdale, who later became air group commander when he was shot down a year later. And of course, we know the story of Admiral Jim Stockdale. So I went to bed about 2 in the morning, and about 9:30, 10 o'clock, my phone rings in my stateroom, waking me up. And there was a duty officer who said, "Ev, you got to get dressed, get briefed for you're going on a mission," which we did. We went. I got dressed. I went up to the air intelligence planning, and we started to plan a strike on North Vietnam. And our particular 5 planes that were going to be led by the commanding officer of the squadron were hitting the northernmost targets. There were 5 A4s from our squadron, which was, the target was just very, very close to the China border. Now, we started planning this, but I have to tell you that months previous, we had been planning missions into Laos, and we'd get up there, plan them, and then scratch. And even got to the point sometimes we plan them, man aircraft, and then scratch. So if we figure, oh God, here we go again. An exercise where we'd probably get up and plan these things and then cancel. At about 11 a.m., as we were going through the process, the air group commander came into the planning room where the air crews, and we were doing our planning. We had our charts out. We were shooting things. He looked at us and he said, this is not just an exercise. Fellas, he said, this is a go. President Johnson just got on national television and announced that we were striking the North Vietnam in retaliation for what happened last night. So being 11 o'clock on the ship, 11 a.m., 12 hours difference, it was 11 p.m. I later found out that the reason that President Johnson went on at 11 p.m. is that he didn't want to lose a TV audience before the American audience went to bed. Here we were planning, and our launch was not for another 3 hours, 1400 time there at the, and we figured a 2-hour flight to our target. So we got busy with the planning and got serious, and then I went down and I got some breakfast. And as I'm sitting there in the wardroom, I was talking to one of the ship's ops officer, and another fellow came in and apparently just had just woken up not too long before and half asleep. He wanted to know what all the commotion was, and so we told him what happened last night. I remember clearly that he was bewildered. He said, "Are we going to just sit back? Are we going to do something?" And the officer said, well, they're going, pointing to me. That was on a Wednesday, August 5th, 1964. The irony was that later on, after I was shot down, I recall that I said, of all things happened to me at that day, I said, that Wednesday is roast beef night on the ship. And when I was floating in the water, I'm thinking, amongst other things, it's crazy, but I figured I'm going to miss roast beef night. So got dressed, we manned aircraft, and I remember the plane captain, as I got on, I was flying side number 411. We had side numbers from 401, 02, and so forth. I was the 8th senior pilot in the squadron. My plane had 408, but I wasn't flying my plane. I was flying another. So I was flying 411. And the plane captain, as I got up and I started to strap in, he patted the plane on the fuselage here, and he was on top of the wing, and he said, "Take care of her, Mr. Alvarez. She's a good one. Don't hurt her." And so I strapped in and launched. And I was the first one off the number 2 catapult of that strike, of all the planes on our ship. I have a portrait. I have a painting of that depicting that day as I launched off. It was done by a professional artist that does combat airplanes. His name is Stan Stokes. We rendezvoused. We flew to altitude. It was a clear day, and I recall, as we're flying in, you could see the coastline from 100 miles out. It was a clear day. I'm sure they could see us on radar coming in, and we went into a gentle decline, coasting in, but still, maintaining pretty good speed. We didn't try to avoid radar. We just went right in from altitude. And it was at that point, as we're descending, that I started to realize I was flying wing on the commanding officer. I'm sorry, the executive officer of the thing, because as it turned out, our flight of 5 aircraft that was going to strike that target very, very close to the China border was canceled by whoever made those decisions, because it was about 12 miles from the China border. And I think they didn't want to risk an incident, international incident of some sort. So they scrubbed that target, and the 5 airplanes joined the other 5. So a total of 10 from our squadron, and our target was Hanoi, which was a torpedo. It was a naval base there. So I was flying wing on the executive officer, and as we got close, the others dropped back, and the XO and I went in first, and to spot the airplanes. And as soon as we got close, we could see them. We could see the torpedo boats lined up in their port, and there was a bigger ship, some sort. And as we got close enough, we were really coming in fast. The XO broadcast out, "Good God," he said, "shoot," and he pulled up. So I was flying his wing. I managed to sort of pull in, line up myself, and I fired my weapon load. We're carrying rockets, one load. In those days, the airplane was limited with a number of stations we could carry, so we had to have enough fuel to get there and get back. So we were limited by the number of rocket canisters that we could. We could actually salve them and fire at once, which I did. And then I proceeded to join, and I called out the targets to the others, saying they're lined up and just on the inside of the mouth of the port. And then I proceeded to turn to join the XO, who stayed low. Basically, he was pretty much skimming the water inside the bay. And so I went to join and cut him off so I could join up with him. And as we went by, I looked back, and the whole sky lit up with flak. The whole sky just started turning black all around me. I should back up a bit to say that while we were planning, there really wasn't much that we knew about the target area. We had a map, high altitude map, and the air intelligence people had said, you might see AAA or something on these hills right around the target. But that was about it. So I was rather surprised to see all this flak coming at me. The sky around me turned black. And as we circled around, I could look over and I could see our other planes from our squadron coming in behind and diving in, firing, and then pulling out. And I could see some of the ships, some of the torpedo boats in flames. When the last of them pulled out, the XO announced he's coming in. He had not fired his weapons. And being a good wingman, and if you had watched the movie Top Gun, you know a wingman always sticks with his lead. And that's pretty much drummed into you, so I stuck with my lead even though I had fired already. But I hadn't fired my 20 millimeters guns. We had also, in addition to the rockets, we were armed with two 20 millimeter machine guns with about 200 rounds each. So I flipped on my weaponry as he went in. I followed him in. But by that time, I'll tell you, I mean, there were tracers coming by me. There was flak all over the place, and the way I describe it sometimes, it was like a synchronization. You know, it just everything seemed in slow motion in somewhat. And as I floated through the air, all these things were popping all over me. It was flak, and red streamers flying by me. Yeah, and it was silent. I was in my cockpit. All these things going on around me, but as I recall, the nervousness had gone away when I first fired. So it was like I was calm, and I was, flipping my switches and lining up and all this, with all this going around me. It was sort of like a choreograph's ballet in a way, the way I just floated through all this. And I lined up, as the XO pulled off, I lined up with the big ship, and I could see all the other ships, a lot of them burning in flames, and I went and I strafed what I had left on the big ship. I could see it bounce off the hull, and my guns ran out, and I turned right away to join the XO, and he was flying low again. So I flew low with him as he went to cross over the little spit of land there that separated the bay from the ocean. And I was closing in on him, and I was low and fast, as fast as a plane would go. I heard a poof, and my cockpit, it was just like a white flash, and my cockpit immediately started to fill with gas, with smoke. And I pulled every emergency lever I could think of, and it was just all in slow motion because we had rehearsed and practiced these emergency procedures, and it seems like I just couldn't do it fast enough. My hydraulic systems were out. I disconnected this. I dumped my load of my empty wing tanks, fuel tanks, and I started to roll, and I just couldn't control it. I tried to get altitude and pull up. So my objective was to get out over the water, but it was very difficult because the nose started to drop, and I started to roll over. And at that point, I was able to broadcast that I'd been hit. And my XO says, "Well, where are you?" And I said, "I'm right behind you." So it didn't take long to figure out that I couldn't control it. My nose was dropping. I don't know how much clearance I had, but I knew that if I stuck in the plane, I wasn't going to last. I couldn't have made it. And the only chance I had was to pull the face curtain, ejection, and eject from the airplane, which I did. But my recollection is I was at least in this kind of an attitude as my nose was dropping, and I went out. Immediately, the blast of the air just pinned my legs back, my arms back. I mean, it just totally out of control. I couldn't do anything. I sort of grayed out with the rush. I felt myself going into like unconsciousness, maybe a semi-state. Then I felt the drogue chute pop, the little chute popped, and then boom, the big chute popped, and before I knew it, I was in the water. And when I came up, I took off my mask, and I took off my hard hat. And I started trying to detach the parachute. And that's another story. For some reason, they had sewn the parachute to the seat pack because the parachute was part of the seat pack. And the rest of the seat pack was a small life raft. And I had my Mae West, that was part of the equipment, what have you, but I didn't want to inflate that because as I was looking around, I was within these high cliffs, and I could see where I had just come, and I had just come from over a high cliff that I was looking back at it. I later calculated that there was a very narrow window that I made. Had I pulled the curtain a little earlier, I don't think I would have cleared that cliff. I would have hit the ground. And had I waited another fraction of a second or a second later, I would have hit the water before my chute popped open. So it was a miracle, and that I was alive. And then I heard the gunfire, AAA shooting at something, and I looked up, and here's a plane from our ship. It was a Sky Raider, propeller-driven planes that was circling around the area, apparently looking for me, and then he skedaddled, took off. I later found out that he had not spotted my parachute. And so here I am. And so I got rid of my seat pack. I dropped that. I dropped whatever I had because I could see fishing boats around me and these large outcroppings coming out of the water, and I wanted to make my way over to one of these, and perhaps I could hide underneath there. A little that I know, but I later found out that I had come down in the middle of what they call the Bay of Hoa Lo, which is one of the 7 natural wonders of the world, with all these beautiful outcroppings that rise out of the water. And today it's a big tourist area, and actually today you could go there and rent a big sampan. They even had them overnight. You could book it and get on and stay overnight as they cruise through through this area. So it's a big tourist spot. And if you're fortunate, they'll even pull out a local guy who will tell you how he captured an air pirate named Alvarez back then. And that's true. I found out that, I don't know if they still do that, but they used to do that. Anyway, so here I am in the middle of this, and I'm trying to swim. I didn't want to inflate my Mae West because I didn't want the fishermen to see me. But as I struggled to swim to one of these where I could see there was a lot of brush on the side of these things, you can probably hide underneath one of these things. The tide was carrying me back towards the base that we had just struck. And I grew very tired. And I looked around, I didn't see anything. Oh, another thing I did. One of the briefings they had told us about the people indigenous to the areas in Laos or somewhere. And I don't know why I related it to this, but I recall that if they see you're armed, they'll shoot first and ask questions later. Well, I didn't want them shooting me, so I pulled up my .38 that we used to carry and dropped it in the water, even though, it had nothing to do with Laos. I was a long ways away. Another thing they used to do was we were trained not to fly with our wedding rings. Because if you're captured, the enemy would use that fact that you were married and use it against you. But I always flew with my wedding ring. There was another reason, safety reasons. They didn't want to get it caught in the throttle area. People have been known to catch their rings and have lost their fingers. So, but I had mine on, and I pulled it off, and I didn't want, if I was captured, I didn't want them to use the fact I was married, so I dropped the ring and let it go with the thought that when I get home, we'll get a new one. So then when I looked around and I saw I wasn't making any headway to head towards one of these outcroppings. And I looked around, I didn't see any boats, fishing boats. So I figured, well, maybe I'll just inflate half of the Mae West. Instead of pulling both toggles, I pull one toggle. It doesn't work that way. It springs you up just as high and as full as it would if you pull both toggles. And here I sprung up, and so I'm trying to deflate this thing a bit so I don't stick up the water too long as I'm inflating it. I felt something whiz by my elbow, and I looked around, and here was a fishing boat with about 4 rifles pointing at me, and they're smoking. There's smoke from the rifles. And then one fellow with a .45 and a revolver. And they circled around me, and I looked at them. Here I am floating, and I said, don't do that. Don't do it. So the person in charge sort of stood up, the fellow with the .45, and hands up. So, here I was, floating in the water with my hands up, and they circled. They came closer. They threw a rope with a loop over it. They got my wrists and then they pulled me close. And as they're doing this, there's one young kid on the stern of the boat with a hand grenade. He's got his finger in the ring, and I swear he was shaking more than I was, and I was scared. But he's shaking, and I kept thinking, don't pull that ring. And then they sort of looped me with rope around my neck and hands, my arms or hands, and pulled me aboard, and then tied me up like a top. And took me to the where they transferred me to another boat, a North Vietnamese PT boat. This one had not been hit. They hid me under a canvas, and there was some officers that came aboard. They wanted to know. They were yelling at me in Vietnamese, and here I am, all trussed up and bound, tied up. They wanted to know something, and for some reason, don't ask me why, I started talking to them in Spanish, saying, what? In Spanish, what? No entiendo, no entiendo. Seemed like a good idea at the time. And they looked through my billfold and my dog tags, and they pulled out my ID card. And they're looking at my ID card, and so that they start talking to me again, and and I think they realized I didn't understand what they were saying. So this one fellow got a piece of paper and he wrote USA, and he showed it. And I said, yeah. And when I said yeah, they started looking around like it was obvious they really didn't know what hit them. These people didn't know. So I was covered back up. Next thing I know, the boat docks. We're transferred off the ship. I was transferred off and walked into a building where I sat on a stool. Then the dreariness started to come on, and I think the adrenaline started to wear off, because I started to feel very tired, and I started to hurt. Even I didn't break any bones, but the ejection and my limbs flapping in the wind. I mean, just really, my joints were hurt. I realized much later on that I had also, from the ejection, had a hairline fracture of my spine, but that didn't bother me that much at the time. And I was there, and the rest of it is, like you say, it's history. I was put into a local jail that night after I was interrogated for a while by the locals. They took pictures, and I recall them taking a picture. Of course, they stood up on the table in front of me so they could, because they could take a picture of me looking down at me. And when that picture was released, I was in my flight suit. They thought I was dead. People thought I was dead because there's all this dark stain here. I thought it was blood. But in reality, what it was is that one of the items that we have on our survival pack, our rest, is a dye. It's a shark chaser to keep the sharks away. Well, apparently that had bust loose, and I had shark chaser, black ink dye all over me. But as a side note, I didn't realize that people were concluding when they saw that was blood and I was dead. I remained in a cell. They put me in a local jail with two other prisoners, and they put my legs in leg irons. I was so exhausted I fell asleep and didn't wake up till next morning when I was taken out for interrogation.
Ev, I'm going to ask you to stop for 1 second.
Yes.
I'm picking up all the sounds of your fingers on the cup.
I'm sorry.
No, not a problem at all. It's something you wouldn't hear. I'm just hearing it in the can.
Got it.
Wow, you are such a good storyteller. I mean, I'm just riveted to, and my grandmother had that gift. She could tell a story, and you just find yourself following and waiting on every word. It's a natural gift.
Well, thank you. They took me out to interrogation, and there were two officers, a naval officer and an Army officer, I guess. And it was at that point where I gave name, rank, service number, date of birth, and they said, they started asking me other questions. I said, I can't tell you. Geneva agreements, that's what they said we never signed the Geneva agreements. We're not at war. We have not declared war. You're a criminal, and you will be treated as a criminal. And there may be a tribunal. And these are things I never thought of. And I said, you're right. There is no declaration of war. And they never signed the Geneva agreements. Nobody told me that, but it didn't make any difference. My conduct was to be in accordance with the Geneva agreements. That's what I stuck to that. They said, well, can you talk to us? Can you tell us are you hurt? Are you hungry? Are you sick? I said yes to all three. So they brought me some food back when they took me back to my cell. They brought food, and the two Vietnamese, one spoke English, prisoners, and he told me what his name was, and he said, we heard about you. He said, we heard yesterday the gunfire, because this jail was right next to the naval base in the town, and he said we could see planes diving from their jail cell. So then the broadcast, the camp or the jail speakers came on, and he said, "Hush, the news." So he listened to the news, and he's telling me, "Oh, 8 airplanes were shot down." What? He says, "Yeah, and they captured 1 pilot." He says, "That's you." And first of all, I'm thinking, this guy speaks very good English, you know. So I didn't want to say much to him, but I thought that was interesting. Told me he had been there for 5 years. He had blown up a truck. 5 years in this. How could anybody survive? Then when they said 8 airplanes shot down, I said, who? I mean, you know, as far as I knew, none of the others had them. I said, man, I wonder who they shot down. That evening, they came and put me in a Jeep and took me to a farmhouse nearby where I was seen by a doctor, came to see about my wounds, and I was kept indoors all day. I was guarded by soldiers, and I would have an interrogator come and periodically try to, you know, get information from me. And of course, I wasn't saying anything. So finally, after about a week, he shows up, middle of the night. He says, "You must tell me everything. You must tell me." I said, I can't. He says, "Look," and he pulled out copies of U.S. News and World Report, copies of Time magazine, copies of Newsweek, the San Francisco Chronicle, the San Francisco Examiner, the San Jose Mercury News. And he said, "Look, your picture, look, all over." There it was, front page, my picture all over the front pages. Magazine, my parents, my home, talked about my family. A big picture of Commander Edge, our air group commander, the Admiral, on and on. I mean, he says, "We know all these things now." So my immediate thought was, name, rank, service number, and date of birth. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, guys. So then they stuck me in a Jeep and took me to Hanoi, and where I became the first prisoner. American aviator shot down in the Hanoi, what later we named the Hanoi Hilton. I arrived there about a week after I was shot down, and that began another phase where I was quite sick from the food, diarrhea constantly, dysentery, I mean, you know, bloody stools, fever, what have you. And then one day they started feeding me. They brought in some food, and when I uncovered it, here was French fries and a fried omelet with bread. And I gobbled it. I gobbled it down. I gulped it. I started crying. Because, I mean, it was just so good. And I had been eating whatever it was, it made me very sick. And I had lost weight. I was losing weight. So the very next day, after that food, I was called in to interrogation. And the interrogator There was usually two people, sometimes three, would comment on how the food was, that I like it, which was very evident. They knew exactly what I could eat, what I couldn't. And he started the interrogation for everything that I knew. It lasted 6 weeks, 6 days, all day. With Sundays was a day I didn't. And they started interrogating me and asking me, looking at the Time or Newsweek about my family. Tell me about your this and that. Tell me about. Then they started asking me military. What really struck me how naive they were, military-wise. They didn't know how a plane could land on a ship, on a carrier, and what have you. And one of my, and they would, started folding in their stories about their liberation and their war against the French and so forth. And so the conversations, it was basically one-sided. They would tell me, and I would ask them a question about the colonial areas, and he would put his book notes away and start telling me stories, which I found interesting. But on the other hand, he stopped taking notes. He would start telling me about his experiences in fighting the French and all that. And then some of the things that they started asking were very rudimentary. And so, he asked me who the commanding officer was. I told him, because I'd seen it was in the article, who the XO, what the squadron organization. I gave him false names. And what are the duties, and what was your duty? And I told him I had just reported aboard, and I was in charge of the popcorn machine. And they looked at each other. How do you spell popcorn? What is popcorn? So, I would spend days talking about popcorn. And they kept asking me over it. We don't understand. Tell us about this popcorn, and the machine and all that. So, I spent days doing that. I spent days listening to their propaganda and asking them questions about their history. And, he loved to talk about that. And then they had somehow I had one of my kneeboard cards with all the frequencies. And I would say, okay, that's, my air-to-air, VHF, UHF, et cetera, TACAD, and it had the frequency of for the approach control, Oakland Center, . It had one in there, and that was Crow's Landing. Well, Crow's Landing was an auxiliary field north of Lemoore in the foothills. It was a target. We used it as a target. It was near a target range and an auxiliary field. He said, "What is Crow's Landing?" I don't know. I don't know. And because I said that, he kept coming back. And what is Crow's Landing? I said, I don't know. I told you. Had to be careful what I told him, because it's hard to remember, because days later or weeks later they would repeat the question and see how I had answered it. So I had to be very careful how I answered. And then when they caught me in a lie, one of my made-up stories, they said, why, after about 4 or 5 weeks, 6 weeks, they caught me in a lie. He says, "Why did you lie to us?" And I said, "Because I thought you were going to kill me if I told the truth." "Oh, no, we're not going to kill you." "You're not?" So I said, okay. But in the end, after 6 weeks, they said, "Look, we have covered everything. You're just a junior officer. You don't know any big secrets and stuff like that." He says, "We have conferred with our military experts, and you don't know any big secrets and plans and military stuff like that." So, which was a relief. And then they left me alone for a long time. I was taken to see the museum of where they had the wreckage displayed of the 8 aircraft that were shot down. because they were still telling me there were 8 aircraft shot down. And so, and I said, I don't believe it, don't believe it. So when they showed it, when they took me to prove it to me, it was very evident that they actually had one SPAD, one AD, and my plane, but they were scattered throughout. The wreckage was mixed up. They really didn't know what they were doing. When I pointed it out, they, our workmen are very inexperienced and all now, but it's true. It's true. If he says it's got to be true, which was the way the officer said that. Because they kept saying, "We don't lie to the people. We don't lie to the people."
I'm going to hold you there 1 second. Alex, can you do me a favor?
Yes.
The boom mic is pointed right at his hands, and when he touches the...
Oh, I'm doing that.
Yeah, I'd like to bring it forward and tilt it more toward his face, maybe.
I'm sorry.
No, not a problem. I think the chair talked with my hands too. It's such a compelling story, I don't want to lose it.
Patrick,
Yes, sir.
I think his chair might be creaking.
Yeah, the chair is creaking.
We have another chair.
Let's try another chair.
And for people
I'll
that
tell you what, why don't we cut for a moment?
Yeah.
You're incredible.
I'm gonna